Tonight, we're going to follow that up with the Beatles' second album, an album that many feel is merely an extension of their first album. While that is true to a degree, I thoroughly disagree with that simple assessment. In fact, I think this album has far more in common with the album that they would record after this one, and that, of course, is their first masterpiece, A Hard Day's Night. So join me in my analysis of the Beatles recording their second album with the Beatles. Well, a lot of people would say that this album was merely an extension to the Beatles' first album, and of course I disagree with that. And the reason that I disagree with it is, first of all, some of the Beatles' original material here really start to launch into what I consider to be classic Beatle material. The album starts off with 3 of Lennon and McCartney's best songs up to this date. That, of course, is All I've Got to Do, Anytime at All, and All My Loving. We even get George Harrison writing his first song on this album. Now, the album's content is similar to the previous album in that there are 8 originals and 6 covers. And just like the last album, Paul even sings a show tune, and John ends the album with the rocker Money. Of course, we have a couple of vocals by George as well as a vocal by Ringo. But if you ask me, that's where the similarities of these two albums end. For one thing, the Beatles' material is much stronger on this album. If you remember, during Please Please Me, the album was recorded with the Beatles only having 2 singles released at that point. Love Me Do, which reached number 17, and Please Please Me, which reached number 2. Of course, the album went on to be the number 1 long player in England for a continuation of 30 weeks, and wouldn't be knocked off the charts until this album came and knocked it off the charts itself. But this is where the similarities end as far as I'm concerned. The original material on this album sounding a lot stronger and closer to the material found on their first masterpiece, A Hard Day's Night. The song that launches the album, Anytime at All, sounds like a prelude to A Hard Day's Night. All I've Got to Do sounds similar, and of course All My Loving is the Beatles' first classic, in my opinion. Now, of course, I do want to bring up George Harrison's Don't Bother Me. I love this song, and with the exception of the 3 songs I just mentioned, I think George's song holds up very well on this album. The story is that he wrote it while he was in the hospital and he didn't think much of the song. I've brought that up in previous videos, of course, but it's interesting that the editor of the Mersey Beat remembers that he was always encouraging George to write a song, especially since he was a fan of a Lennon and Harrison composition called Cry for a Shadow. Ever since hearing that, he had encouraged George to write his own material. As he remembers, George wrote it, and the title really aimed at him, saying, okay, I've written this song, don't bother me. Now, this isn't exactly how George remembers it, and I favor his side of the story, but boy, that sounds like a story that should be true if it isn't. Now, the Beatles also cover 3 Motown hits on this album, and really, they take ownership of all 3 of these songs, especially with the powerful song, Money, the song that ends the album. Now, you also have to remember the Beatles recorded singles at this time as well. Of course, it was at this time they also recorded as singles only, I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. So right out of the gate, this album was supported with 2 number 1 hits. Not only number 1 hits, but number 1 hits worldwide, and would launch the Beatles to a worldwide stage at this point. Now, this gets around the Beatles' work ethic, and it started right at the top with their manager, Brian Epstein, who, with George Martin, made a plan. And that was that the Beatles would supply X amount of singles and X amount of albums every year. And for a while, with the exception of 2 of their movies, their hits weren't very often found on their albums. And it's for this reason that many years later, the Past Master series of CDs were put forward. Now, not everything was Sun and Roses on the album, that's for sure. There are a couple of Beatle work songs here that don't work as far as I'm concerned. I've never been a fan of I Want to Be Your Man, and Little Child just lacks something. But even in these recordings, there are very interesting moments. Now, the Beatles always tried to provide George with at least a song aside to sing, and a song per album for Ringo. George writing one of the songs for his vocal, and Ringo singing I Want to Be Your Man. Now, why the Beatles chose Devil in Her Heart for George to sing is beyond me. This track is one of my least favorite Beatle tracks to listen to. At least at this point, with lesser Beatle tunes, we get some interesting ideas. This entire recording, the instrumentation, everything, the sound, just doesn't sound like it fits on this album. And though I love the Music Man, Paul goes to the well once too often with the song Till There Was You. It seems to me that these recordings were done as a duty more than an exploration on what and where the Beatles would go next. Up to this point, Lennon and McCartney were still trying to prove their worth as top 10 songwriters. Now, during these sessions, the Beatles actually got access to some 4-track machines for the first time toward the end of recording this album. And there's even one track on the album that they call a fake stereo. That gets down to basically reductions. Now, we've talked about reductions in the past. The Beatles would record from one tape machine to another in order to free up tracks. This is called a reduction. When you record the sound of one machine here and transfer it to there, you have to understand that each machine, the tape has hiss. The idea is to record the signal hot enough that the music you put on or the sound source that you put on a tape actually overrides that hiss and you don't hear it. But when you bounce that material over to another tape, the hiss on that tape exists, and of course the hiss that was originally on starts to build up. George Martin had a rule about that. No more than 3 reductions ever. And of course they handled this further by increasing the inches per second that they recorded tape on. Often they would record their rhythm tracks at 15 inches per second. On this album, they doubled that to 30 inches per second. A faster and thicker tape equals a cleaner sound every time. So you can see, even in these early stages, they're starting to advance technology. At this point, this is being suggested by George Martin and his assistant, Norman Smith, who does not get anywhere near the credit as an engineer that he should. He was the Beatles' engineer from their very first album up to and including Rubber Soul. I've alluded to the Beatle machine. In fact, an upcoming video that I'm going to do will be on what I call the Beatle machine. Now, I mentioned Paul McCartney's bass playing in my last video, of course. I was very impressed with it, and there is some fine bass playing on this album as well. But it's on this album that Paul almost seems tired in his bass approach. This wouldn't last too long. You have to understand that the beginning of the recording of this album started about 4 months after the release of Please Please Me. The recordings occurred in the months of July, September, and October, and finally the album would be released in November. The Beatles were busy touring. Connections were being made in America, despite Paul saying many times they weren't going to go to America unless they had a #1 hit. And there are places on this album where each Beatle has moments of weakness as well. But the strong songs, the strong recordings on this album, along with their 2 new singles, are magnificent. Both John and Paul developing into world-class songwriters, and even George Harrison dipping into the well himself with the song Don't Bother Me. So in my final analysis, my opinion is this album has less to do with Please Please Me than it does A Hard Day's Night. As a matter of fact, many of the songs on this album are in the movie. So in a way, the album itself is part A to the soundtrack album A Hard Day's Night. In fact, there are more songs on the album Hard Day's Night that aren't in the movie than there are songs from this album. Now granted, in the movie, these songs are used as a backdrop while the Beatles escape their manager and go out partying on the town. But I can tell you, when the movie came out, this was fresh music, and every Beatle fan in the theater was cherishing even these songs along with the brand new material of the movie.